I was born on the 5th of December in 1956 in the Chelsea Hospital, which was at the time a small community hospital in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne in the state of Victoria in Australia. My mother was 40 years old. My father was 45. My parents brought me home about a week after I was born. I came home without a name because they couldn't agree on what to call me. The nurses in the hospital had called me Henrietta. I was glad that didn't stick. My father died when I was 8, and my little brother Pete, who arrived 18 months after me, succumbed to leukemia at the age of 8 when I was 10. And so from the age of 10, I found myself at home, alone, with my mother. In my second year of high school, I discovered theatre. This was huge. I'd always felt like an observer in my life. I never saw myself as an actor in my life, or certainly not on the stage. But the moment that I found myself in front of an audience for the first time, I knew I'd come home. Somehow I felt seen. I felt involved. I felt in control. I felt more real than I'd ever felt before. From this point on, there was absolutely no doubt as to what I was going to do when I finished school. I was bound for a life in the theatre. I never questioned the validity of my dream. In fact, it wasn't a dream. It was an inevitability. It was a given. But my mother wasn't so sure. She was firm. She said, okay, you want a career in the theatre, then you need a backup. I found an acting school in Melbourne because at that time, the only professional school of performing arts was in Sydney. And I felt too young. I wasn't ready to leave home at that age. So I applied for the school in Melbourne, where I could also study for a Bachelor of Education in theatre. So my mother was happy. During the course, we were privileged. We got to work with some really experienced, some amazing professional artists, directors. One in particular was a man called Lindsay Smith, and he came from the Australian Performing Group, which was based in a venue called the Pram Factory in Melbourne. And this was the home to some of the most innovative, the most exciting artists, writers, directors, actors, dancers, musicians, filmmakers throughout the whole country. When I finished my course, I joined them and I found another home. This home was a place of politically and socially engaged theatre. There was no separation between art and life. Art was our life. We were living our art, both in purpose but also in practice. There was no separation, not that I could see anyway, between what I did and who I was. They were heady and exciting times. From there, I went on to work with many other companies, touring both nationally and internationally. We worked in theatres, we worked in community halls, we worked in school gymnasiums, in hospitals, on building sites, in the street, in car parks, even on buses and boats. We assembled our own lighting rigs, our sound systems, and we played the instruments. We imagined our projects, we dreamt them into being. We wrote the scripts, we composed the music. We performed work that amused, that entertained, that shocked, that challenged, and that nourished our audiences and ourselves. We made people think. We created arguments. We stimulated debate. We questioned everything. And we were a family. All this came to a halt when my mother became ill. She had a bleak diagnosis. I decided that I'd stop work and I'd return home in order to try and ensure that she had her final wish. She'd always said, "The only way I'm leaving this house is in a box." Well, even though the doctors had only given her a couple of months to live, actually she hung on for another 2 years. But she did. She died on the sofa, in the living room, in her home, as she wished. I grew up in that house. I never knew another family home. Sure, I'd lived in other houses under other roofs, but, you know, they weren't really home. Not really. The house was sold, and I packed up again, and I moved back to Sydney. But I don't know, I found it hard to settle. I was restless. I was in search of something else. I'd never believed that life was just, we're born, we grow up, we go to school, we get a job, we retire, maybe we have families, and then eventually we die. You know, I grew up, I was educated Catholic, but I don't know, there was something, the rituals and the teachings, they never really resonated with my inner world. Still, I felt there had to be something more. And so I researched many, many different spiritual traditions. And finally, I found my place in a yoga and meditation ashram in Sydney. My path took me towards Buddhism. And eventually, my path intersected with the path of another seeker. And he became my husband. Pierre and I were married in the year 2000 in my stepbrother's living room in his house in Melbourne. My brother-in-law sang the Marseillaise, and we toasted with French champagne. The next day, we flew to Nice. We planned to stay for 6 months. Whilst Pierre's application for Australian residency was processed, we'd been told that this was easier to do from out of the country. And, you know, I thought, well, I didn't have anything particularly holding me in Australia anymore. So I thought, what an adventure. Go to France for 6 months and learn French. We moved into Pierre's family home. Now, this was not an easy time. I'm sure you can imagine what difficulties might have arisen. The fact that I was a foreigner, that I was 8 years older than Pierre, that I didn't speak a word of French. None of these things really went in my favour. But, you know, I did my best to fit in. My mother-in-law had many contacts in local government and the community, and she was sure that she could find me a job very, very quickly. She carted me around to interviews, and, you know, for her, my lack of language posed no obstacle. Well, eventually she gave up. And I ended up finding work as a cleaner in a nearby village for a German woman who, when people would come to visit, she would say, "She's an actress from Australia." She never introduced me as her cleaner. I felt really welcome in her home. As noted in my primary school reports, I have been known to talk a lot. It's true, I've always loved exchanging stories and ideas. But here, I was mute. It drove me crazy that I couldn't speak. We would be invited out, and I'd spend the evening asking Pierre to translate. I'd have things to say once, you know, I'd got the gist of the general discussion, the general conversation. But by the time I'd explain to Pierre what I wanted to say, he'd say, "We've sort of moved on now. That's not really relevant anymore." And that's a pretty accurate summation of the way that I felt at that time. Irrelevant. No one showed the remotest interest in me. How could they? After the usual icebreakers such as, do you miss Australia? And then waiting for Pierre to translate. Well, it was evident that the struggle just wasn't worth it. They couldn't, and I couldn't. I mean, it was just all too hard. I've never felt so isolated. One evening, we were at a function in honour of the mayor of Grasse. Now, I dreaded these events because there was always that awkward 3-line conversation, you know, about missing Australia. And I did have responses which I had prepared. But they never quite matched with the questions. Anyway, I was seated next to a man that I didn't know, which was not unusual because I didn't know anyone. We introduced ourselves. He was Georges, and I was Judith. We muddled through some clumsy franglais sort of pleasantries, and then, of course, he picked up on my accent and he asked me where I came from. When I said Australia, he said, "Oh, you come from a beautiful place in the world." And then he said, "What did you do for work back there?" So, to the best of my ability, I explained that I'd worked in the theatre for over 20 years. He said, "Did you train for that?" I said, "Yeah, of course. I went to an acting school, and also I've actually got a Bachelor of Education in drama." Well, he lit up like a Christmas tree. Suddenly it's all about CVs and interviews and appointments and meeting this person and that person. And the following September, I found myself in front of 12-year-olds because this man was the director of a school in Grasse, and they were looking for an English language theatre teacher. As I say, I found myself facing a group of 12-year-olds in September. I had huge plans. I talked about my background. I explained that we'd be making our own works, okay? We would create our performances in response to the world around us. I told them this is the way I'd always worked, and I had no intention of doing traditional end-of-year plays. I clarified that as artists, we had a responsibility to interrogate our world, to question our world and our place in it. It was going to be a very exciting and empowering journey for all of us. So after a rather long silence, a hand went up. Have you ever been on the TV? It's been a long road. Every year, we start out with a discussion of where we are in our lives. We talk about the things that bother us, the things that concern us, the things that distress us, the things that inspire us and nourish us. We've explored issues such as consumerism, bullying and harassment, women's rights, peer pressure, fear, war, but always with the intention of opening up discussion with our audiences. 4 years ago, the issue that we all felt was growing in importance throughout the world was the issue of forced immigration. We decided that we would tackle this theme by researching the ways in which it affected us. We wanted to understand why people would leave home, often under terrible circumstances, and travel unbelievable distances only to be faced with rejection, with isolation, with loneliness, with violence, even imprisonment. We began by contemplating what the notion of home meant for each of us. We came to see that the idea of home as a feeling could vary greatly from the concept of home as a place. We also found that this was something that we hadn't really considered all that deeply from our place of middle-class white European privilege. And we discovered, as the Somali poet Warsan Shire says, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. On a personal note, my tiny taste of displacement, ridiculously insignificant in comparison to such stories, did, however, open a door to identification with the people whose stories we explored in our research. In discussion, as kids in the international section of this French school, we had shared stories of being uprooted for whatever reasons, and surely we could try to imagine, even if from miles away, what these people might be feeling. It ate away at us. What began as an international and political concern became very personal. As our research continued and our work took form, we saw how connected we all are as human beings. Statistics became people. Walls of difference began to disintegrate, and pathways through diversity began to open up. That sense of other became less and less important. In fact, it became invalid. There's a monologue in the show from a 73-year-old Palestinian woman, and she's been a refugee since the age of 3. She's a real person, and her story is true. Her voice is that of a 17-year-old Grasse high school student from a comfortable background. But at that moment, they are one and the same. Emily becomes Alia. Alia is Emily. And this is an extraordinary testament to the human capacity for empathy. Emily does not speak for Alia. She finds the place in her heart where she and Alia are one. When we came to the end of our first year's work on the show, well, we knew we couldn't let it go. The international crisis was not diminishing, au contraire. It was only worsening. A school play became a mission. Everyone had seen and experienced that theatre did have the capacity to change things, if only to open doors to different ways of seeing. The change in us was palpable. If our attitudes, if our perspectives could change, then why not others? We all came to see that in opening our eyes, in asking ourselves genuine questions, we could never go back to being the people we had been before we began this work. Or that if we did, it would be in the full knowledge that it was by choice. We have been performing this work for 3 years now. We've taken it to Johannesburg in South Africa. We've been to Geneva. We've just returned from Malta. We've performed in venues, many venues here in the Alpes-Maritimes and in the Var. We have performed in schools, in gymnasiums, in churches, in community halls. We're mobile. We can perform with a couple of wooden boxes and 2 chairs. We have 2 versions of the piece. We can perform in English and in French. The title of our work is Home, a place or a feeling. I left my home over 20 years ago now. And I have the feeling that everything I've ever done, everyone I've ever met, anywhere, everywhere I've been, has all been leading me to here. And I know one thing to be true. Every day, every moment that I spend in the company of these beautiful, courageous, compassionate, and committed young people brings me, step by step, closer to home.